We should be rolling. All right, there we go. Let me get that posted to Discord. Let me see what I call this. Ciphers. Okay. All right, going live right now. I don't expect anybody to necessarily join, but am trying to continue to plow through. This is lecture 25. There are a total of 28, and there will be 3 remaining after this. So there we go. Okay. Just pulling up and making sure I've got what I'm doing here ready to go. Yeah, so lecture 25. Let me hit a few things, and I don't know how long this one will take. It'll be a little longer than the last one. The last one was just DES, and that was it. This one is, well, it's a little longer because it's going to talk about a little bit more about symmetric keys, and which is kind of a continuation of DES, and then it's going to shift over to public key ciphers, which RSA is sort of typical. And really, I don't know, I think the majority of it is probably the modes of operation, and in particular, we're going to talk about block ciphers using symmetric keys. And to kind of start with, and I've got a couple, I got the book, got a few notes and things I wanted to make sure and hit on our way through this material. But, hang on a second. Okay. Yeah, so let's talk about the idea. This is these slides. This is slide number 2. Here's the whole fundamental idea. The electronic codebook. So back in the day, long, long ago, here's to the day, and you had encoded messages, right? Especially in, say, war. So you're in war, and you have a risk that if you send a messenger with a message, right, and then the messenger is intercepted, and the message is, therefore intercepted. So they would do encryption from a long time back, like hundreds, thousands of years. There has been encryption for messages, especially during wartime. And what's interesting about that is they would have a thing that was called a codebook. And the codebook was just how to decipher, the coded message. So you knew how to decide it. Essentially, the codebook was a symmetric key cipher. And meaning symmetric key, meaning both sides had to have the same cipher, right? Sorry, had to have the same key. That's the fundamental idea of symmetric key. And the electronic codebook then is just the same idea, only it's taken from the tangible. There's literally a code book, and we're just going to encode that. So it's really just, in essence, it's a way of saying, I know the cipher, you know the cipher, and we know how to do it. Now, one of the things that happens with an electric code book, ECB, is that if there are 2 messages that have the same text, then they wind up with the same output. And that turns out to be a problem, because if I have a chunk of text, and I'm going to show you an example here in just a second. But actually, I want to jump ahead um, over to here. Here's an example of, let's take a JPEG or let's take a graphics file. In fact, I've got another one that I actually like better. This is a book. If I can, there we go. This is a really good book, Practical Cryptography in Python, written by a couple of really good friends of mine, Seth Nielsen, Chris Monson, very smart security guys. But in it, they give this example of a message, and that's the message. Okay, top secret. And then you encode that. Well, what have you got? You got chunks of black, big chunks of white, right? And what it means is that because you take, say, 64-bit blocks and you encode it a certain way, the next 64-bit block is going to look exactly like the other ones. So this one's showing the Linux, penguin, and how you can kind of still see that it's a penguin. I don't like that example as well. And what you want is pseudo-random over on the right. But here's what you get with the example that Chris and Seth have. That's the message. When you encode it, that's the encoding. I think that's even better because it's kind of like, oh, encoded message, top secret, right? Because the fact that you have a single 64-bit value and the fact that there's a lot of duplication, the patterns don't get removed, the patterns remain. So in other words, two blocks that are identical encode to the exact same cipher text. No good. And these examples, the penguin, the top secret, give you an illustration. If I tried to take a graphic message and encode it and then transmit it, you can visually see it. Well, whether it's mathematical stuff, text stuff, data of certain types, you can basically, um, visually you can see it, but it illustrates the fact that the patterns exist and can be discerned, even if they're more alphabetical, and you can still see and emerging patterns, right? That's the basic idea, and I like that better. In fact, that really ought to be, as always, the slide order makes no sense at all. In fact, you know what I wonder? Yeah, I'm going to do something. I'm taking control myself, and yeah, what I just did was just move that slide up. So what you can see here, what this is trying to illustrate, and this is also, unfortunately, again, cluttered typographically. I'm going to do one more thing here, sorry. I'm going to do something. When I was prepping this, I had the note in my head. This will literally only take a second, and it will be cleaner. Check it out. Okay. Notice, because the problem is when it was like it reads same key. No, they have nothing to do with each other. What they're trying to say, it is same key, but the problem is the whole thing just gets kind of clogged. This is an additional sort of note. Okay. So I take this plain text, right? And I encode the plain text using the key for this block cipher, involving this block cipher encryption. And then I create ciphertext. Now, if I take the same plain text, this is the point. It's very poorly illustrated here, okay? And I take the same plain text, and this is just decryption at the bottom, encryption and decryption at the bottom. But if I take the same plain text as before, and the same key as before and apply the same block cipher encryption, I'm going to get the exact same ciphertext. And I'm going to do it again. It's a horrible graphic, but that's the principle it's trying to illustrate is that if I take the same data that matches another block of the same 64 bits and I apply the same key, I'm going to get, so I don't have So therefore, I don't have over on the right this pseudo-random pattern that's very difficult to see patterns. And this not really random at all because of the weakness of electronic codebook. Okay, the biggest weakness. I hope that's really a clean illustration of that idea. So here's just an example. Let me just double check something. Yeah. Well, let me do, okay, I'm going to do this one more time. Sorry, I'm just going to clean these as I go. I did go through these and I should have flipped the order before I started. But what I'm going to do right now is from the electronic codebook, there's where we started, electronic codebook, and that you get the principle. Here's the visual illustration. And then this is the challenges. A passive listener, okay? A man in the middle, somebody who can intercept the message, even though it's encrypted, the message itself is encrypted. Then anybody, if you can see the ciphertext, and if what you see is this, you can make inferences. If what you see is the top secret message from this practical cryptography in Python, sorry, I got to make sure I can see the screen, right? Not so secret. I can visually see it, even though that is encrypted. That's encrypted. Okay, so anybody who can see it, and we call this person a man in the middle. That's the technical term, man in the middle. A man in the middle attack is one in which the interceptor leverages that for some reason, right? For example, maybe they just want to know information or see information, right? Maybe they want to alter information. Now, here's an example of how to alter it. Imagine, now, there is this notion of a man in the middle. When we talk about a man in the middle attack, what we're talking about typically is that somebody on the inside, somebody in between, sees the message, does something to it, and forwards it on. Now, this is not dealing at all with things like message digests or methods that we apply in order, let me get my things shifted, in order to change something. We have other ways of protecting against the notion of the message that was sent has data integrity with the message that was received, right? So this is ignoring that protection against this. But typically a man in the middle, I'm going to intercept it, I'm going to somehow decrypt it, then I'm going to change it somehow so that I send it on and then the receiver doesn't know that something was changed. Like, let's say, for example, I'm sending you a value of a check. So for example, and I somehow whatever, it's a check for me. I change the name on the check to me. I change dollar amounts when it's supposed to go to me, but I change it so it gets bigger. So here's an example. Here is a plain text document. Okay, so you have to understand that it's a plain text document. The name, position, and salary are just headers that we understand. Okay, maybe they're in there, maybe they're not, but we understand them anyway. Well, you can notice here, if you look at John Adams, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So these are 64-bit blocks. We're taking the text file, and these are 8-bit characters. And or if they were double byte characters, it would be 128. But just saying, there are blocks. And we have J. Edgar Hoover apparently working in the same office with Howard Stern. I don't know. I can't explain the example. But apparently we can blame Kaufman et al. For this taken out of their book. But what you can notice is that imagine that this was like a payroll you were trying to send to somebody, and we were, in cahoots with Howard Stern, who was on our side, and we wanted Howard to have a lot more money, and Neil Bush, the accounting clerk, was making $623,000. J. Edgar Hoover, Howard Stern, both making, in the 30s, right? You can see it. Well, we're trying to figure out where in the encoded message, you know, where there are similarities. Well, what you notice is that right here, this block of 7 spaces and the character 3, and then this block under Howard Stern, 7 characters and the character 3, 7 spaces and the character 3, that the plain text is the same. And if we're using electronic codebook, the cipher text will also be the same. Okay? So I could look at that and I could say, oh, these 8 characters precede, they're the beginning of the salary. If I know that the payroll looks like name, position, and salary, if I know that, I can now see exactly where the salary lines up. Now, maybe I know through social engineering, I know how much J. Edgar Hoover makes. Well, now I know, what the first line of the Howard Stern, what Howard's making. So in any case, what I can now do is any number of things. I could go up here where John Adams is, maybe again, Howard Stern's on the inside with us, and just grab that cipher text and drop it here to this cipher text. And then when I decode it, it's going to come out 78. Or I drop the cipher text for Neil Bush, which we all know makes the most money in the office. Inexplicably, how does the accounting clerk make more than the president? We don't know. But I could grab that one and copy that cipher text over. And now Howard Stern just got a check for 628,206, right? So that's an example of I can recognize block boundaries and use that, right, as a way of either deciphering or of at least making an intelligent modification that is to our advantage. That change and then send it on. Again, I'm ignoring data integrity. I don't care who, the authentication of the senders doesn't matter. I'm kind of immune from that, but I am not immune to a solid check on the data integrity because I'm definitely violating the data integrity. Anyway, so let me see. Yeah, so really what I'm doing is a couple of things here, and then there was something I wanted to share from the textbook. Number one, I've got to break the cipher at some level, and the man in the middle attack presumes that I crack 2 things. I understand how to alter it, and that I do it in a way that's not detected. Okay, and the whole world of data integrity is, which we'll talk about with message digests. All right, now what's the problem? What is the fundamental problem? Oh, I want to remind us of this idea. With respect to the weaknesses, right? There's a weakness. These are the weaknesses. Anything that's repeatable or that we can infer introduces weaknesses. Like if I know the layout of the payroll system and I cut checks based upon the text that comes in, it's a super contrived example. But if I know what this layout is, then I can say, oh, and I'm not sure what the encryption is, but it's electronic codebook. I can see that the 2 3s are the same, that the empty space plus 3, they're the same. Therefore, I know where the beginning of the salary is. If it was a string of numbers, I wouldn't know. Although actually we'd all be making really solid bank, maybe. No, because I'd have to include the decimal points and stuff. But yeah, okay. Now this is the point. This is the point. From your book, this is page 638. Most ciphers are block ciphers, okay? They're defined to take as input a plain text block of a certain fixed size, typically 64 or 128 bits. You understand that taking a smaller size means there's going to be more repeatability than there would be taking a larger size, right? Like 128 bits. But using a block cipher to encrypt each block independently, which is what electronic codebook does, has a weakness that a given plain text block will always result in the same ciphertext block. Okay, back to the penguin. That block of white is always going to give me this block of white. Okay, so recurring block values in the plain text are recognizable as such in the ciphertext. You can see the patterns, making it much easier to break the cipher. So to prevent this, we augment block ciphers. We augment them in ways that make them dependent. Remember, when we're doing the encryption from the plain text to the ciphertext, and we do that in ways that are independent, right? That block, like that 3 spaces 3, is always going to look the same in the ciphertext. I need those to look differently, so that one of them looks one way and another one looks a different way. So that instead of getting recognizable penguin outline, I get pseudo-random white noise. Okay, you got it? That is what modes of operation is all about. All right. So from your book, ways in which a block cipher may be augmented. And how are we augmenting the block cipher? We're augmenting it to make it not independent, so that one time looking at a certain pattern like the all white is not going to look the same as another time looking at a pattern of all white colors in the penguin example. Or 7 spaces and a 3 will not look the same as 7 spaces and a 3 later on. Okay? That's what modes of operation is trying to be. And then a common way of doing that is cipher blockchaining. Okay, so we're into the blockchain world. And so here's an example of blockchaining, which is kind of the segue, right? What we try to do is we take this initialization vector, which you'll notice is 8 bits. We take 8 bits of plain text, and we take a similar, or whatever the group, whatever the set of plain text is, okay? Could be 8 bytes. Let's say it's 8 bytes, so we get 64 bits. Similar 8 bytes. We XOR those together. Then we apply the symmetric key, the same symmetric key. We apply it, and that renders this block cipher encryption. We take the ciphertext that results from that, and then we take, as an example, the next 8 bytes of plain text. Imagine going back. Imagine it's consecutive blocks of data out here in this white, okay? Or in the white over here in the belly, or in the black over here, or the yellow, in the foot, okay? So I take the next set, which might, for the sake of argument, is going to be the same text as the last time, but it's a new block. It just happens to be the same text, okay? We take the ciphertext that we generated, we use it as an initialization vector, and we XOR the ciphertext with the plain text. Then we apply the key, and what we get is a different ciphertext. So in that case, the same plain text with an initialization vector that gives me this ciphertext. When I do this one, I use a different initialization vector. I use the ciphertext of the previous block, and I chain these together, okay? And do the encryption, I get a different ciphertext. Then I do it again, XOR that with the plain text. You're still applying the same symmetric key, but you're getting different ciphertext out the bottom. That is blockchaining, okay? It's one approach, one mode of operation. Let me just double check to make sure that there weren't some notes that I wanted to hit. Oh, back up. There was one, which was this question of like, where does the initialization vector come from? And the answer is just part of the algorithm, okay? It's a starting point. I'm sure there are variants of where that comes from, but here's a quiz question. Which traditional method of performing multi-block encryption is open to attack because two blocks with the same plaintext value will also have the same ciphertext value? Okay, that answer is electronic codebook. Again, the fundamental idea with the electronic codebook is I just look it up and there it is. If I look it up again, same thing. Look it up again, yet again. That's why I get patterns. Patterns are deadly to encryption. They just open you up to decryption. That's the answer over there. Let me see. What else was I going to say? Okay, nope. Noopa, noopa, noopa. That's good for there. Yeah, so Cipher blockchaining. One other thing I wanted to say about it. It's usually done with where the encryption is DES. So you can still, but the idea is you're taking, so it doesn't matter what this encryption algorithm is. I'm taking the plain text, XORing it. I encrypt that, and then I use that output. It stands alone as the value of the ciphertext for that block, but then it becomes an input to the next plain text into the encryption and pops out for the next ciphertext, which even if the plain text was the same, the block text, sorry, the ciphertext is going to be different, and so on and so forth. But what else do I want to say? Yeah, so the idea is that no two blocks that have the same clear text value or plain text value are going to generate the same ciphertext. That's the idea. Yep. Here's a related question to the previous one. Which provides assurance that two identical blocks of plaintext will be different after they're encrypted using the same key? First of all, same key, you got to know it's symmetric key encryption because same key. Two identical blocks of plaintext are going to be different. And the issues here, the options are electronic codebook. No, electronic codebook has the problem that the two blocks with the same plaintext gives you the same ciphertext. That's the problem. Message digest has to do with integrity. I can tell it hasn't been tampered with, but it doesn't do anything. If I do electronic codebook, I can apply message digest, and then I can tell it wasn't touched. But when I look at it, I can still see the penguin. Digital signatures, which guarantee that the sender was who we thought they were. Well, great. It really was Bob over there, and it really was Alice. But that's also a penguin. Cipher blockchaining, that's your answer. Okay, let's talk about some of the weaknesses. Where is it? I thought I had. Sorry, man. I'm just off on my off on. No, it's like I'm missing a slide. Oh, I know what it is. The weakness, it's finally telling us the weakness. I moved this slide. There we go. Okay. A couple things about the weakness of, that's Codebook, but weaknesses of Cipher blockchaining, okay? Um, Yeah, the weakness of ECB, one of the weaknesses of ECB is that you can do with AWS resources, throwing a ton of resources at it, you can brute force attack and break a DES key in less than an hour. So uh, when you do blockchaining, it makes it much more difficult, much harder. That's the whole punchline. Okay, let's talk about triple DES. This will come as a shock to you. Yeah, all you do is you take DES, which we've already talked through, and essentially it's like, well, what if I didn't want to make up a new DES is not bad. It's just 64 bits isn't big enough. What if I wanted to make 168 bit or 112 bit key length, longer key lengths? And that's all I'm doing. I take plain text, which is this $1,000. I encrypt it with key one. I decrypt, I take that ciphertext. I decrypt that with key two. I get this ciphertext. I encrypt that with that a third key. Now, what are those three keys? They're chunks of this 168 bits. So you can give me 168 bits, and I take, chunks of that and use them as key one, key two, key three. I can get by with a shorter length if key one and key three are the same. Also, by the way, I encrypt with the first key, then I'm not decrypting to get back to anything. I'm decrypting with key two as if it were another encryption algorithm, right? It's like giving medicine to a healthy person makes them sick. You got the idea? Um, yeah, that's triple D. That's triple DES. Nothing crazy there. And then here's a few others. Blowfish. Bruce Schneier is one of the legends in the field of security. AES, which you may have heard of, called Rindall. Um, it was the NIST's recommendation for replacing DES. And you got 128-bit data block, different lengths of the encryption key, and it runs 6 times faster than triple DES. So it's the most widely used symmetric key block cipher for commercial apps. Anyway, RC2. Now, hard shift over to public key. This is, in the tradition of the slides, this is what we call a segue. These are the inventors of the RSA algorithm, which is a public key encryption. So we are shifting everything we've talked about. Let me back it up, okay? Just to be clear. Starting here, electronic codebook, symmetric key, okay? You've got one shared key, has to be the same. Weaknesses in electronic codebook, reiterating those problems, how to exploit the problem. We use blockchaining to try to make it, but we're still symmetric key, okay? And then we can do triple DES to be even stronger, but we're still symmetric. We still have one key, okay? Known by both sides. Enter public key encryption, okay? With these guys, R, S, and A, which is where the name comes from. And as you can see, they received the ACM Turing Award in '02 for the Turing Award, if you're not aware, is kind of like the Nobel Prize in computing. I've seen it sometimes just given to people as almost like lifetime achievement, and other times they'll cite specific accomplishments. And RSA, I think, certainly worthy. Here's the idea of comparing public key to symmetric key. Oh, let me just say one other thing about. Well, I can say it here as well. Up on top, horizontally, is symmetric key encryption. Okay, where I've got a plain text message, a symmetric key, some encryption algorithm. So that's DES, the star ES. Why does it have to be made so hard? It stands for, I'm pretty confident, AES or DES, but it doesn't matter because it's an illustration of symmetric key. There's DES, AES, okay? And then I wind up with a ciphertext. I apply the same symmetric key of the same algorithm for decryption, and I get the plain text back out. Okay. Now, one other thing to just say, if with symmetric key encryption, if we each have the key, then it doesn't, anybody who has that key can see the message, right? And when I encrypt it, I'm encrypting it for that symmetric key because I use the same key to encrypt it that you use to decrypt it. With RSA, what I've got is a public key and a corresponding private key. Now this is showing in the bottom, it's showing basically two directions of public key encryption. So what I do is I create, we're going to talk about this. I create a public key, and from the public key, I create a private key. The private key I hold on to, and the public key I post to the world. That's the public key. If you want to encrypt a message that is directed at me, that only I can understand, that only I can decrypt using my private key, then encrypt it with this and send it to me. And that's true of the whole world. Anybody in the world who wants to send me a personal private message, encode it with the public key that I posted for the world. Okay? Encode it that way. And then, sorry, I have to throw this in there because I'm getting hoarse again. Then only I can read it with my private key. And nobody else can see that message encoded with the public key. It's all really very cool. It's some very cool creation. This is illustrating the fact that if then the person over there in host number 2 wants to send, so I'm going to take my plain text, use the RSA algorithm with the public key, and I'm going to encode it. I'll send that ciphertext over here to this person. They'll apply the private key to be able to read it. Then if they want to respond to me, they've got to use my public key to encode their plain text reply using the algorithm into a ciphertext that I can then apply the algorithm to using the private key and get their plain text back out. That is what we're trying to do. The fact, kind of mathematically that works is kind of freaky and reasonably cool. One of the keys we're going to get into is that public key ciphers like RSA are orders of magnitude slower than symmetric key. You can do symmetric so much faster. So the vast majority of encryption involves symmetric key encryption. And one of the things that RSA gets used for a lot is encrypting DES keys. So for encrypting a symmetric key in order to share symmetric keys, we'll often use RSA. If you try to do every message, the whole thing would computationally bog down. Because you're something like, the throughput of RSA is something like 1,000 times slower. When we say orders of magnitude, we mean orders of magnitude. Okay. So like session key establishment, we'll use RSA. Use the slow but really reliable to swap the symmetric key. And then we'll use while our session is live, we'll use that symmetric key. Another really interesting difference between DES and RSA is that RSA is based on math. DES is kind of almost like you're taking this key and you're like folding it until it blends out and smooths out. You're not with RSA, you're not doing it over and over and over and over and over again to get it to a random place. It has to do with factoring relative primes and the difficulty. Essentially, it's like a bidirectional. It's asymmetrical. But how hard is it to go down a water slide? Not that hard. How hard is it to go up a water slide? Really hard. How about a ski jump? I don't know if that's a good analogy because I think technically it's operationally impossible to decrypt um, when you've encrypted with RSA without knowing the private key. But there's always, at the end of the day, anything has a brute force approach, but the strategy, the complexity of the problem required to solve to go back the other direction, it's comparable to climbing your way up a water slide, as opposed to going down the water. I think the analogy works from a level of effort expended to do it and the fact that you're in the same tube but going different directions and the complexity gets harder. Let me see. Oh, with RSA, we never transmit keys. I mean, I publish my public key and I never disclose my private key. I mean, it really is brilliant. Now, it's also true that with symmetric keys, none are transmitted either, unless we encrypt them with RSA and then send them over. RSA is a mathematical implementation. Like I said, it's based upon a math problem. In contrast, what they sometimes call diffuse and confuse is the approach of DES, right? You're going to going back, take something that looks like the middle and make it look more smooth. That's the idea, to take the patterns away. All right. Okay. Looking at this slide, here's a question. If Alice, first of all, always in security, it's Alice and Bob. It's always Alice and Bob, I think because of A and B. If Alice uses public key encryption to provide privacy for a message transmitted to Bob, she uses public key. And Bob also uses public key encryption to keep his reply to Alice private. So Alice is using public key. So Bob has to have a private key. Bob's using public key encryption. Alice has to have the private key. So what's the minimum number of individual keys required to accomplish this securely? Think about it. Right here, it's also in this picture. Okay? And it says in the question, assume that a public-private key pair counts as two keys and that no private keys are shared. No, symmetric private keys are shared. This you are welcome to go check out. I don't believe that it shows up in any of the exams or homework or anything, but you're welcome to try to understand better. And then here's Eve doing the man in the middle attack. Okay. Here we go. Now we're going to get into the grunge. I will say this. There is a homework at the end. Pay attention because here's homework question B. Using the slides titled the RSA algorithm as a model, apply the algorithm using the following values, P, Q, E, and M. Now, then comes a question on the exam that basically asks almost just like this without providing you any of the information. And I'm just letting you know that I'm going to provide you with the equations. I just think it's arbitrary to make you just randomly and arbitrarily remember all those equations. So just so you know how to apply them, but don't memorize them. It won't hurt you to try to memorize them. So when you do apply them, it's going to make sense. We don't need to. Okay, so here's the foundations, the review of number theory concepts. That's really, it's a bad title for the slide. It's not just a review of number theory. Hey, and now some number theory. These are the RSA foundational elements of number theory, okay? Number one, Two integers are relatively prime if they have no common factors greater than 1. I would restate it. Their only common factor is 1. If you factor them out, their only factors common between these two two integers is 1. Okay? So 9 and 8 are relative primes. Okay? Now we're going to get into some mathy stuff that kind of transcends, honestly, kind of transcends my mathiness. But that's foundation number 1. Remember what relative prime is. Number 2, remember what modulo arithmetic is. And we do that in CS a lot, so it shouldn't be a big shocker to see modulo arithmetic. The idea behind modulo basically is that it's integer division. When we do real number division, right, we get a fraction, 17.94. When we do modulo arithmetic, modulo division, we get, what do they call it? The quotient and the remainder? Is that what it's called? But you know what I mean. If you say 12 divided by 5, you're going to get, what is that? I could use the one down below, 11 divided by 5. You're going to get 2.2. That's not a mod operation. That's a real number division. Mod operation would say, take the number on the left, divide it by 5 as many times as you can evenly. And it's almost like, I think of mod as like, okay, I got to get to 11. Let me do my example of 12 before. I got 5. Okay, it takes away one time and I just throw it away. I don't even care how many times it goes in. Goes away again. All right, are there 5 left? At least 5? Yeah, how many left? As soon as the number left is less than 5, that's my mod. So 12 mod 5 would be 2. I can chunk away a 5, and now I'm under 5, so there's 2 left. 11 mod 5, right? 15 mod 5, 0. Okay? It's just the remainder. Like if you did long division, it would be the remainder. Okay? And that's the modulo operator, the little percent sign. All right. This is how you can calculate mod on a calculator without a mod key. Fine. So here's the algorithm. Here we go. Get ready. Step number 1 is generate a public key. So this is how we're going to do it. We're going to generate a public key. We're going to generate a private key. And then that's basically what we're going to do. Generate a public key. From that public key, we're going to generate a private key. Later on, we're going to talk about how to decode with the private key. Okay? And honestly, the mathematical foundations, I have understood it in the past. And my recollection is I had a graduate networking class maybe when I was in my master's program in the 90s. And I don't even remember, I guess, I don't remember when this showed up. RSA appeared in 78. Okay. But here's where we go. And I'm looking at my big screen, which is the same slide that you've got. You pick 2 large prime numbers, P and Q, and they're each 512 or 1024 bits in most current implementations. And so we'll just do a trivial one where P is 7 and Q is 11, okay? But they have to be prime numbers. Those are not large, but it makes it computationally easier to conceptualize. You multiply P and Q together, creating a product that we call N. So 7 times 11, which are the 2 prime numbers, P times Q, gives me N, which is 77. That's called the common modulus because it's used as the modulo for both encryption and decryption. Okay, now what we do is look down here where we go, the public key is a tuple that goes E comma N. Now look on the next slide and look at the private key, E comma N. So both the public key and the private key the public key discloses the modulus, the second value. And that second value is the same for both the public key and the private key. Okay. Mathematically, this isn't that hard to do. It's hard to, it would be difficult to break, but it's not hard to do. So what we then do, we take the product of P minus 1, so that would be 6, and Q minus 1, which would be 10, that gives us 60. So we have the value 60, and we select a public key, E of n. We already know what n is, because we already did it, 77. And E is relatively prime with that product, so 60. Now, what I don't understand, and I think, again, I may have understood it in the past, but I don't right just sitting here because I haven't, done a deep dive to get into it, is, that value gives us 60, and I need another number which has no common factors with 60. Well, 7, first of all even numbers have a common factor with 60 other than, it can't be an even number, right? But it could be 59, could be 7. So I don't know, why, what makes a preferred number. You know what I mean? I don't know, why what's a good number, what's not. But it should be the fact that you can test that when you do that homework assignment, you make your public key and you make your private key, and then you take a random message, which it gives you, which we'll go back through it, okay? You take a message, and then you encrypt it, and then you decrypt it. Okay, here's how we compute the private key, okay? The private key, again, n is already done. We already have n, because you have to share it. And then do I have, no. Okay. Then what we have is an equation, okay? That D times E, again, E is, where's the backup one? E is the value of the public key, so that's 7, okay? So I need to find a D that satisfies this equation. All right, so I say, the equation is that D, when multiplied by E, modded by this value of that we talked about previously over here, P minus 1 times Q minus 1, right, will give us 1. So we can also define this calculation this way as an equivalent equation. And so the bottom line is, when we're done, we already did that when it was 60, and we need some number, which when we multiply it times 7, so we need some number that is a factor of 7, that when you mod it with 60, you get 1. So we need the smallest one we can find. So a D value of 43 would work. And you can kind of work your way up and say, well, what D value is going to work, and you can kind of see that any smaller, what about 103? 103, I bet would also work. Because I'm just adding another 60 into the mix, right? So you go 103, 103. And if you did 103 times 7, you'd get 721, and you'd mod it by 60. Somebody try this. Somebody. Would it work? Would it work? Yeah, I'm pretty sure it would. But anyway, yeah, anyway, I'm just going to do it. And when I find that value, I'm using, when I use 43, that value times 7 gives me 301. 301 mod 60 is going to be 1. So I'm still noodling on the previous one. Yeah, no, it works. Actually, it works. It works. I just did it in my head. Um, if you had 721, what's 60 times 11? That's 660. 721 minus 660 is 61. It's going to mod one more time, and it's going to leave 1. Yeah. All right. That's how we get the public key. So we now have a public key, which is 777, and a private key, 4377. It's a tuple. Now I just pick some message such that M, let me see, such that M is less than N. N is 77. We're going to use M equals 9. And remember that when we say message, any digital message is ultimately a numerical value, right? Then C is defined in the following way, okay? So for any M less than N, and again, N is 77, C is the ciphertext equivalent of M defined by that equation, okay? So C would be 9 to the 7th mod 77, which gives us 37. That's the encrypted value of 9. So when the message was 9, the value is now 37. Magic. But that's how the thing works. And you just got to go through it yourself to figure that out. And anyone who wants to encrypt a message M and who has the public key has everything they need to do the encryption. And then this is the decryption, and that's the definition of the decryption. M, to get M back, you take C raised to D and mod it with N, and that'll get you the plain text message back. There you go. And that's your homework right there. Apply those algorithms. But again, I'm going to give you the names, encryption, decryption, public key, private key, encryption, decryption. I'm going to give you the names and the equations when it's exam time, okay? But it'll be the same operation. You got to do the homework, so it'll be the same operation as what you're going to do in the exam. That, my amigos, is it for RSA. Let me just double check to make sure that there's anything else. Nope, that's it. That's all I wanted to talk about that. Coming up, if you're tracking these, where we go next is we have 3 left. Three. Remaining is message digests and authenticators, which we've kind of talked about a little bit, certificates and authentication protocols, and transport layer security like TLS, SSL, HTTPS. All right. Coolness. Alrighty. That's it. That's all I got. That's a little more like an hour closer to it, but again, I'm available on Discord. Hit me up if you have questions.